the story of the Romanov Four Sisters continues to fascinate people around the world. This is the second part of a three-part series, shedding yet some more light on the lost lives of the four Grand Duchesses.
All four Grand Duchesses were honorary regimental chiefs and took a great interest in their regiments. In 1912 and 1913, both Olga and Tatiana took part in the maneuvers at Krasное Selo in late summer. Tatiana recorded in her 1913 diary, "In the morning at 10:30, Olga and I went by motor to the regimental parade in full dress uniform. We were on horseback there. Uncle Nicolasha met us. I stayed by the side of the road where there was a crowd of people in the suite. Olga went with Uncle to her regiment. Afterwards, when they came back, we went to the front of my regiment. I greeted each escadron separately, then went back and stood on the right flank of my regiment in front of the commander. Olga stood with her regiment. After that, Papa arrived here and began to inspect my regiment. I followed him to Olga's regiment, and she went around with him, and I followed behind. After that, Papa went to the tent and stayed there. Olga, Uncle, and I went on farther. When my regiment started its ceremonial marches, I rode ahead of the regimental commander, behind General Uranovsky, who commanded our brigade, stood until the whole regiment had passed by. Olga did the same in front of her regiment." In spring 1913, the imperial family set out on a journey, visiting various places associated with the history of the Romanov dynasty as part of the Tercentenary celebrations of Romanov rule, culminating in the imperial family visiting Moscow. Olga described the journey in a letter to her grandmother. "The trip was so awfully interesting. We saw so much that my head is all in a whirl. All those wonderful old churches. At Nizhny Novgorod and Kostroma there were tea parties with the nobility, terribly stuffy of course, but not too dreadful. At Yaroslavl there was a big party and concert. Sabinov, the Zbruyev Quartet, Chuprinikov and Plevitskaya sang. There was a big ball in Moscow, which was very beautifully put together and had 2,000 attendees. Papa, Tatiana and I left before the supper. Aunt Olga with us, but the rest stayed on until the end. Mama was there too." By 1913, prospective husbands for the older Grand Duchesses were being talked about. As mentioned earlier, the Prince of Wales was one whose name came up, but also Prince Alexander of Serbia and Prince Carol of Romania's names were also brought up as potential prospective partners in newspapers. In March 1914, Empress Alexandra's cousin, Queen Marie of Romania, accompanied by her husband Nando and son Prince Carol, visited the Romanovs at Tsarskoye Selo, and probably talks began about potentially matching Grand Duchess Olga with Carol, to whom Tatiana appears to have taken a shine, affectionately referring to him as Karlusha in her diary. The Romanovs paid a one-day reciprocal visit on June the 1st the same year, setting sail from Yalta the night before. It was to be in vain, Olga already having made up her mind that she would not marry Prince Carol, telling her French tutor Pierre Gilliard that she was Russian and intended to stay Russian, and that her father would not force her into a marriage that she herself did not want. The idea of a Romanian Romanov marriage was not completely lost, however, as on a visit to Tsarskoye Selo in January 1917, Prince Carol also asked the Tsar about the possibility of his marrying Grand Duchess Maria, to which the Tsar responded that Maria was still a schoolgirl, and such a marriage was out of the question. Following the return from Romania, the summer continued as usual for the Grand Duchesses. There was a cruise in the Gulf of Finland and a visit from their cousin George Battenberg with the British squadron. The Grand Duchesses enjoyed being shown over the ships and meeting the British naval officers. Tatiana described it in her diary. "We were assigned 4 young men, what they call midshipmen in their language, and what we call the ship's Garda-Marines. They showed we 4 and Aunt Olga about and explained everything. They were very nice. Then we had luncheon with Admiral Beatty. The commanders of the other ships and his wife were there. After luncheon, everyone took photos. Then we went on their boat past the Queen Mary and the Princess Royal to the New Zealand, which is Georgie's ship. From there, back on the Alexandria and to Peterhof. Following this was an official visit by President Poincaré of France in early July. Then, rather than a continuation of cruising on the Standard, war. On 19th of July 1914, Grand Duchess Olga recorded in her diary, "After the all-night vigil, we learnt that those pigs, the Germans, had declared war on us. Help us, O Lord." And Tatiana recorded that the dragoons and Finnish regiments had already set off for the war. In early August, the imperial family headed to Moscow, where there were church services at the Kremlin and inspections of military trains and hospitals. After Moscow, the family visited the Trinity Lavra before heading back to Tsarskoye Selo, where the Empress along with Olga and Tatiana began training as Red Cross nurses. They were helping in the hospitals as early as August, when Tatiana wrote to her friend Olga Voronova, "Mama, Olga and I go every day to the Palace Hospital, where we bandage the wounded. We both have 3 people each whom we must bandage." Before long, they were assisting at more serious operations. On September 3rd, Tatiana wrote to Grand Duchess Ksenia that they had assisted at the amputation of an index finger, saying, "It was not particularly appetizing, but we got through it safely." As time went on, Tatiana became a skillful nurse. At first, Olga and Tatiana looked after wounded soldiers, while the Empress and Anna Vyrubova looked after the wounded officers, but soon Olga and Tatiana also began nursing officers too. Tatiana took a special shine to one of the wounded officers, Dmitry Malama, who gave her a French bulldog in September 1914, which she named Ortipo. Tatiana doted on Ortipo, who slept on her bed, disturbing Olga in the same room with his snoring. The days soon took on a regular routine of visits to the Znamenia church, nursing, playing games with the recovering wounded officers, lessons, and then back to spend time with the officers in the evening. Maria and Anastasia, while too young to train as nurses, also spent a lot of their time visiting the wounded, cheering them up and playing games with them. Olga and Tatiana also established committees, Olga accepting donations to help the families of the called-up reserves, and Tatiana for helping refugees. At the infirmary, aside from nursing duties, the Grand Duchesses spent endless hours with the wounded, bringing them puzzles, teaching them to knit, and keeping them entertained so it was not so boring to be lying in bed, as Tatiana wrote to Olga Voronova. On New Year's 1915, the imperial family's great friend Anna Vyrubova was severely injured in a train wreck to the point where her life was feared of, and Olga and Tatiana would visit her in the hospital every day after doing their dressings. Empress Alexandra had worn herself out towards the end of 1914, and Olga was taking on a bigger role in the family, taking on messages and requests and relaying them back to her father. Her responsibilities continued to grow through these war years, but they also took their toll on her, as by the end of the year of 1915, she too was suffering from illness and exhaustion and was prescribed arsenic injections to help restore her health. Olga was not happy to have to take time out, writing to Grand Duchess Ksenia in early November 1915 that, "I too, to my embarrassment, have gone off somehow, for 5 days now, and have been lying down and not able to go to the infirmary, which is awfully upsetting, as I'm so used to seeing everyone." In May 1915, Anastasia was devastated when her little Pomeranian dog, Schwibzik, died from a brain inflammation. While she herself may have been called Schwibzik before this, it was from this time onwards that Anastasia began using the name as a nickname for herself in her letters to her father, who was often absent at the front and visiting army units. Later that year, he would take over supreme command of the Russian army. In October 1915, the family visited the Emperor and Alexei at his military headquarters for 4 days, after having visited hospitals in Tver, Ryazan, Veliky Luki, and Orsha. They eagerly received letters from the nurses at the infirmaries at Tsarskoye, keeping up to date with their patients at home, while enjoying seeing their father and brother and hearing about the goings-on at the front from officers. In April 1916, the Empress and the Grand Duchesses visited the English hospital in Petrograd. One of the nurses there, Canadian Dorothy Cotton, described the visit. "We had a visit from the Empress and 4 of the girls, Olga, Tatiana, one 15 and one with her hair down her back. She looked about 13, supposed to be the beauty of the family. The 2 oldest were dressed alike in grey, so simply but awfully smart. They are dears and went about so nicely and talked to everyone. They gave each patient a little icon to wear around his neck, and in most cases put it on them themselves." In May, the Empress and her daughters travelled to Mogilev for the Emperor's birthday, and then the whole family travelled on to Crimea. It was to be their last visit as a family there. There were church services and visits to the sanatoriums and infirmaries. At Sevastopol, the family inspected the dreadnoughts Empress Catherine and the Empress Maria. Tatiana wrote about going on the Empress Catherine. "We walked around the deck and then went to the lower one, into the casemates, descended into the turbines, climbed the tower where they showed us how to load a gun. It was terribly interesting." The visit culminated with a day at Evpatoria. Maria recorded in her diary, "We went to Anya's dacha. Rita was there, had tea and ran about barefoot in the water. Had a walk at Sarabuz station, and Anya went back to her dacha." The family parted ways at Kursk, with the Tsar and Alexei returning to Mogilev, and the Empress and the Grand Duchesses back to Petrograd. Through the year, there were several more trips to Mogilev to spend time with the Tsar and Alexei. The Grand Duchesses thoroughly enjoyed the break from routine, despite missing the wounded whom they cared for. Near the Tsar's headquarters was a refugee camp for families who'd had to escape from the fighting at the front, and in summer 1916 they became playmates of the Grand Duchesses and would wait for them in the mornings to come out of the train carriages. Grand Duchess Maria's 1916 diary makes frequent reference to playing with these children in August and September, with such comments such as, "We tossed the children into the pit with Lavrov and Yergashov." There's even a photograph in the imperial family's photo albums showing the children standing in a big pit posing for a photograph. Tatiana took the time to label the names of the children in her photo albums.
Order now your copy of the Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal, which is an impressive 512-page book, featuring nearly 200 black and white photographs, and a 56-page photo insert, of more than 80 high-quality colorized images, appearing here in print for the first time.